Welcome everybody to the lecture series Perspectives Ukraine, which is hosted by the Institute for Political Science at the University of Duisburg-Essen and the Institute for Development and Peace. I think we have our participants coming in, and we will wait for some more minutes for everybody to join us. But I'm happy to already welcome Stanislav Budnitsky. Stanislav, it's a pleasure to have you here in our lecture series. Stanislav, I will first introduce yourself and myself, and then we're looking forward to listen to your interesting talk today. Stanislav joined the research group Legitimation and Delegitimation in Global Cooperation, I think in August 2021 at the Center for Global Cooperation Research at the University of Duisburg-Essen. And you are also affiliated with the Indiana University Bloomington. And you're mainly working on internet governance, on media globalization, nationalism, strategic narratives, which is so interesting at the moment, since we are talking about different perspectives on the war in the Ukraine, and you will give us the opportunity to reflect very carefully on the role of the Russian media system and the war in the Ukraine. Thanks a lot for that. I'm working at the Institute for Political Science, and I'm happy to chair the session. So we will give you the floor for the first 20 to 30 minutes, and then everybody out there is invited to put questions in the question and answer tool, to post questions via the questions answer tool rather than via the chat. That would be great. And we will have about 25 minutes to discuss your interesting thoughts on that topic. Stanislav, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Christina, for the introduction. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and for the opportunity to thank you to the series organizers for the opportunity to share some of my observations on this topic. I will share my screen momentarily. So what I will address today is the developments that have taken place in Russia's sort of media landscape, media ecology since the start of the war on February 24th of this year. Since the start of the war, the observers, Western media, for example, in particular, have been raising the question, and still do, that can be summed up, in plain language. What do Russians know? What do Russians learn? What of the war do Russians see? So in essence, what is media like in Russia during all of these events? And this is basically what my talk is going to address. I gave a similar presentation 1 week into the war. And at the time, of course, it was everything was too new. So I mostly focused on the lead up to the war, sort of the preceding years, and thinking about what media developments have enabled or allowed this war to take place for the Russian audiences to be sort of on board with it. Now, 3 months into the war, what I'm going to talk about mostly today is what has happened since. So on the one hand, what the Russian state has done in terms of its repressive or restrictive or censoring measures to control the narrative domestically, first and foremost. And then I'll talk about how the media ecosystem, if you will, has readjusted or realigned itself in response to those, and what has happened since. And so the implicit or sometimes explicit reason for why people care about what Russians see, for example, is because there is this assumption, which is true to a large extent, especially in kind of closed media systems that are dominated by the state, by the one hegemon, which is that the media influence public opinion, and public opinion then influence the actions of the government. So that's sort of in all of those media coverage about what do Russians know, what do Russians learn, that's been the implicit assumption. And so that's why, that's why we should care basically about the Russia's domestic media, even though the war is happening, outside of its borders in Ukraine. And so I want to begin by contextualizing Russian media landscape and sharing a little bit of statistics so that you understand, where do Russians get their news, for example, and how many Russians have access to the internet. Because in those questions, in the coverage of what do Russians know, the implicit assumption oftentimes is that, well, the internet is going to be, the savior. So, a lot of Russians are online. A lot of Russians have access to whatever information they want, even if it takes a little effort, such as using circumvention software. And so, surely there's no way of hiding, what's really happening in Ukraine from Russians who are now internet connected. And as you will hopefully see by the end of this this presentation, while the Russia is indeed very highly connected, the reality is much more complicated. And there is no direct connection sort of between the number of people online and their views and them being, for example, opposed to the war. So here you can see two things. So first of all, Russia is quite a highly connected country. You see that 68% of Russians are use the internet daily or almost daily. On the right, you see the breakdown by age, which is, I guess, quite important because the younger generations, the youth, they tend to be more active politically in some ways. So on the whole, Russia is a highly connected country. In absolute numbers, Russia's online audiences is the largest in Europe by far, because obviously with the population of 145 million plus, just by sheer numbers, it is large. And one more important thing. So I put the link to the poll from which the statistics come from at the bottom, and the sourcing of any polling done in Russia right now is a very important and highly politicized question, because we see polls coming out of Russia all the time, and the legitimate questions that people ask, can we trust these polls? Because in a kind of authoritarian regime generally, and specifically during wartime, can we trust the polls? Or there's a lot of criticism of the polls, which suggests that we shouldn't even have them because they legitimize the war, because of course people are scared. Of course people are going to either not answer if they're against the war, or just say that they're aligned with the Kremlin's agenda. So the issue of polling itself is very contentious. So I want to highlight that all of the statistics, all of the slides that you see come from a very recent poll from April 22nd, done by Russia's most reputable independent pollster, who is designated as a so-called foreign agent by the Russian state and has been faced various repercussions from the Russian state. So there is no incentive for this particular pollster to, let's say, inflate the numbers in favor of the Kremlin. So that's a very important point to make. Now, given that so many Russians are online and have access to the internet, one might assume, or one might jump to the conclusion that, again, they are primarily consuming news from the internet. They have access to all of this, any resources from Russian language oppositional media to, via Google Translate, for example, if you wanted to go to, I don't know, BBC or France 24, Al Jazeera, to that. But again, what we see from this poll is that even though a lot of Russians are connected, the number who get their news from TV and who also trust TV the most as their news source is dominant. So in other words, put simply, TV still rules Russia's media sphere. Drives Russia's public opinion to a large extent, and therefore it is really the control of the TV, which has long been firmly in the hands of the Russian authorities, that really has the ability to fundamentally shape long-term the public opinion. So this is something very important to keep in mind. So 70% get their news from TV, and 54% trust TV the most as their news source. And so let's look briefly as to what the state has done since the start of the war. I should say that what we saw in this past, in the first several weeks and in the first 3 months has been unprecedented. The media and internet crackdown has been slowly going on for the past, if you will, 20 years, 10 years for the internet. So we can start at different points, depending on what we're talking about. But what we saw in the past, so it wasn't sudden, right? So the whole system, the whole logic of the media system, the political system has been coming to this point. But what we saw in the past months, in the past weeks, has shocked even long-time observers such as myself, and people who have been much more observing it for much longer, or been much more connected to the or working in the field. That really took everyone by surprise. That should be noted that very few journalists, very few observers anticipated what was going to happen. And so in brief, you see kind of the main developments on the part of the state. So I will go into propaganda and the in a little bit, but I'll speak to some other points here, such as, for example, the fake news law, which the government passed in the first weeks, which essentially, put simply, basically gives the state the right to call any reporting on the war fake news. Even calling the war as opposed to a special military operation is considered fake news. And so basically it essentially outlaws any reporting on the war that doesn't align with the state narrative. And the prison time, the maximum punishment for it envisioned by this law is 15 years in prison. So this led to the immediate sort of exodus of hundreds and possibly at this point thousands of various of media workers, of journalists, producers, managers, etc., because it basically became impossible to report on the war at all. What also has happened, and again, this law, the fake news framework, existed before the war. It's just that it's been applied specifically to this war and with this penalties of severity that we have not seen prior to the war. Another thing that existed before the war, but again, that severely intensified during the war, is this foreign agent designation. So again, since about 10 years ago, Russia introduced this foreign agent designation. So it designates nonprofit organizations and more recently individuals as foreign agents. And what this means is that if you're a media, you have to put this large text before any, even if it's your personal post on Facebook, you have to put this large text saying that this message is provided to you by a person or organization designated by foreign media of the state, blah, blah, blah. And also it makes your life much more difficult because it's much more difficult to, you're basically shunned. No newsmakers want to talk to you, no advertisers want to give you money. So basically it makes your activity nearly impossible, and it spelled death for a lot of different news outlets. So since the start of the war, every Friday night, there's been a new list of this designated of journalists or media organizations or nonprofits designated as foreign agents, released by the state every Friday night. And so, with the blocking, it's much more straightforward. So they blocked basically blanket, carpet blocks, if you will, nearly all oppositional alternative kind of media websites, and they have blocked also Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. So I'll address it in a slightly more depth, the point about the intensification of the state propaganda. So it really went into overdrive, again, even by its own standard in the first few weeks of the war. For example, in the first few weeks, all of programming on the two main most watched TV channels was political. So they canceled all entertainment programming, and it was, all politics all the time, 24/7. With this, high-pitched political shows, kind of calling, just reinforcing the state narrative. And for example, one thing that you can see here in terms of the kind of the state narrative is that the names of this republic. So the war was premised on the idea that Ukrainians are Nazis, and Russia has to defend ethnic Russians in Ukraine. And so the words kind of genocide and the names of these republics start being mentioned. But as you see, these words and the word genocide have increased. Their mention increases, exponentially right before, or a couple of weeks before the beginning of the war. So, one would think that if Russia cared about the genocide, or if there was actual genocide going on in those places for years and years and years, and here you see statistics from 2013, then this would be a subject talked about at certain length over the years. But you see this complete spike literally in the 2 weeks before the war to really kind of rile up the population for it. And so the state has been pushing this various narratives of legitimizing its war. So this comes from the first weeks, and it's still one of my favorite. This is one of the top kind of most watched analytical shows. And if you're an international relations scholar, maybe you will recognize Barry Buzan, kind of an eminent or preeminent international relations theorist based at the London School of Economics. And here, one of the reasons given for the war, and there are many reasons that were given, there's kind of a whole host that are thrown at the wall just to see whatever sticks, is that the West has been using his theoretical framework to push Russia since the early 80s, and Russia is merely now adapting this IR theoretical framework created by this preeminent international relations scholar to merely use it now against the West. So Russia is just simply mirroring Western tactics. Was one of the things that that Russian media has pushed onto its audiences. And so I was just shocked when Barry Buzan popped up on the screen, full screen. And so this narrative has been shifting completely to align and legitimize whatever the Russian state has been doing. So, for example, once the blitzkrieg of the first weeks failed, so once Russia failed to take Kiev and retreated and regrouped and then started attacking and capturing the southeast of the country, incessantly the narrative has become that well, that was the plan all along. Naturally Russia is now focusing on this. And kind of in this language of, well, this was, of course, envisioned by our, foresightful, commander-in-chief and the army. This was always the plan. This, of course, is the most logical thing to do. While, of course, the entire world knows that it's not, that it's simply due to the complete failure of the first, few weeks of the war. And so now I'm going to turn and talk about how the media sort of environment responded and what has happened. And I'm going to go kind of one by one. So the first thing that has happened is that after that initial, complete sort of shutdown of alternative or independent or oppositional news media, you see them slowly reemerging in one way or another. So, for example, Russia's only remaining independent TV channel, which was already a satellite channel and an internet channel called TV Rain, was shut down in the first weeks of the war. So you can see that their YouTube flag here says that with 3.2 million viewers or subscribers rather, that the channel has been blocked in Russia, and they are temporarily, hid their videos on their website. But what happened in the following weeks is that individual journalists from this channel have launched or anchors rather, have launched their own YouTube channels. And so you see here 6 different YouTube channels by anchors and journalists from this channel that was shut down that are now available to, to Russian viewers. Now, of course, if we add up their subscriptions, where you can see on screen, they don't add up even to a third of what the channel had. And so this may be a matter of time, although it will take a long time to, get those numbers. And so we have this kind of and many other, I should note that, several other publications or YouTube channels were started completely anew and some of them have gained up to, over 1 million viewers, for example. Such as the channel by the associates of Alexei Navalny, one of the opposition leaders who's been jailed for over a year in Russia. And so we have this, I'm looking for a term, kind of almost like fictive or fictitious or misleading, maybe plurality, where you have this almost now overabundance of this niche or almost samizdat, kind of self-published almost news websites Telegram channels, YouTube channels. And so as an individual, you can easily fill up your 24 hours with all of this oppositional content that you want. However, the reason I'm calling it illusionary or misleading is that this fragmentation is not necessarily good. So it's great that these journalists have found an outlet. It's great that audiences have access to that, but it still does not compensate for the the numbers that they had. These are all more like podcasts, with no access to events on the ground, with no network of correspondents on the ground, with no access to speakers. So these are in the format of podcasts, which again is good as well and important, but this is no match for the radio stations and the TV channels and the proper newspaper organizations that were shut down. However, again, the field is somewhat rebounding, you can say, or bouncing back a little bit. And again, to reiterate, all of these journalists are based outside of Russia, so they all had to flee, basically. Now, another thing that's been happening is Western initiative to essentially, message or convey messages to Russian audiences, and this is very, of course, sort of legacy logic of the Cold War era with the public diplomacy with international broadcasters, right? When the Deutsche Welle and when the BBC, Voice of America broadcast into the Soviet Union alternative narratives that one could access via shortwave radio. And so following the same logic, several Western initiatives, private initiatives, I haven't seen any governmental initiatives so far, although there has been talk and reporting of them, so maybe we'll start seeing them soon in the coming weeks or month. But for example, Bild, I don't need to explain in this audience, of course, what it is. They have started a YouTube channel and a Telegram channel in Russian. And again, with the premise that Russians need to know the truth. So we are doing this kind of almost as a humanitarian mission, if you will. So again, a welcome development for sure, but so far it's 50,000 YouTube subscribers, 13,000 Telegram subscribers, which again depends on if you're a glass half full or half empty kind of person, whether you think that's a lot or not a lot, but it's definitely not enough to make any substantive, let's say, political difference, right? Although again, it's a welcome development in the sense that any Russian who wants to access an alternative opinion ideally should have that option. Another initiative has been by the consortium of the main Danish, Finnish, and Swedish political dailies. And so they all started reporting in Russian. So you can see at the bottom here, and they all kind of came out with this manifesto, if you will, explaining that at the bottom, you can see here, Europe has changed irreversibly as Russia's war of aggression has progressed in a shocking way. Every day, war raises new questions that only the free independent press is able to seek in-depth answers to for its audiences. And again, a much welcome development, but I have to say that I'm quite skeptical of the effect of this initiatives beyond sort of the humanitarian aspect of hiring and giving employment to journalists and keeping the profession alive, which hopefully one day the journalists will be able to report from Russia, and humanitarian mission of providing this alternative view to Russian audiences. And the reason is because not only from the Cold War do we know that that's not beyond, again, the humanitarian mission, that this doesn't really have a major political effect, I don't think, but also more specifically with the Ukrainian crisis, because we saw the exact same development in 2014 after Russia's initial military incursion into Ukraine, where there were multiple governmental and private Western private initiatives aimed at creating outlets, Russian language outlets, and sort of conveying information to Russia. And they either sort of just waned out, they existed for a little bit, and then they, I guess, funding dried up. And And so you can see, for example, in this, in the left top corner, this is a screenshot of the Twitter account of Helsingin Sanomat, the Finnish newspaper. So you can see two things I'd like you to draw your attention to. So first of all, the number of followers, which is, right, 450 people, which is not a lot, you know, for a country of 145 million people. Again, this is not to disparage their initiative, but I'm just saying that, you know, thinking about it analytically and in terms of its effect, that's not a lot. And I checked their, you know, Telegram channels in Russian, it's roughly the same number. But another thing that I want to draw your attention to is to the year which this, and this is the account specifically of the Russian version of the newspaper, right? And so it joined Twitter in March 2014. And what happened in March 2014 is that Russia annexed Crimea. And so this is basically the same publication doing the same thing again. And so they already launched this Russian feed back then, and it existed until October 2014. And then, you know, they stopped tweeting and publishing in Russian. And so 8 years later, they are kind of restarting this effort, which again is a welcome effort. And you know, I wish obviously this effort to you know, achieve its goals. But again, speaking analytically, I'm kind of having a déjà vu in terms of these initiatives, both governmental and private. Again, but I do think that they are important for preserving the basically a professional journalistic class of Russian-speaking journalists who, again, hopefully one day can, you know, go back to Russia and work there, and for audiences who are seeking alternative narratives to the state narrative. Now, in terms of blocking, so blocking is pretty straightforward. You know, the stage is blocked, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. And so what we see is that it's been quite effective. So here you can see in red is the statistics for the percentage of Russian internet users reportedly using them in March 2022 is in red, and in March and a year ago in blue. And so what you see is that for the 3 block networks, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, their usage has dropped greatly. You know, from 32 to 23%. For Instagram, from 10 to 6 for Facebook, and from 5 to 2 for Twitter. And it's bound to go even lower, likely because with time people stop using VPNs and don't want to bother with it, and so it usually kind of plateaus at even lower. However, the YouTube, which has not been blocked yet, and we can discuss in Q&A kind of the hypothesis for why not, it's because all of these channels that I pointed to, right, all of these 6 channels and many more YouTube channels, that's where a lot of the discussions are taking place. So its viewership has actually grown, and so we can also see that the usership of the Rush of VK, which is basically, you know, very much state-aligned platform, it has jumped tremendously over the course of the year. And so another development is the use of VPNs. So there's been a lot of reporting in almost somewhat sensationalist language, excuse me, of, you know, it's skyrocketed, booming. And if you look at the percentages, then it does look impressive. You know, it grew by 2,000%. It grew by this number. But, you know, that's also impressive. The usage of circumvention software, which basically allows you to bypass or circumvent state censorship and access Facebook or Russian independent media website, despite Russia blocking it, the Russian state blocking it. But what we see is, again, that the first of all, that it started from such a small number that even the rise of 2,000% or like 60 times, I saw another number, brings it up from, you know, point something something to, you know, to 5%. And here we can see that, you know, 10% of users total self-reported using circumvention software. And again, this is a poll conducted on April 22nd. So this is not even 2 months or almost 2 months into the war. And so again, we know from literature that the use of these technologies slows down and goes down over time, that it peaks, initially as an initial response, but then people just get tired of it. And the Russian state is getting better and better at blocking the VPNs themselves, the technology. So again, we're seeing a lot of reporting of how effective the Russian state has been on blocking the individuals. And so not only do you just go and download the first VPN that you can find and off you go, but now not only is it a hassle to use the VPN, it's also a hassle to find the VPN you can use. And so most people outside of the kind of the hardcore that are really, truly committed to and invested in getting kind of politicos invested in getting alternative news, for example, or using these platforms, they just don't bother eventually. And so 3% is kind of the standard number of internet users. So for example, in China or in other kind of repressive online or restrictive online environments, 3% is around what it usually plateaus at. And so that's probably what's going to happen in Russia eventually in the course of the next few weeks or so. And by the way, another important point to make is that we shouldn't presume, and again, we know this from statistics of the usage of the internet, that if people are using VPN to circumvent those restrictions, if they're going to Facebook, if they're going to Instagram, that they're necessarily going to oppositional website or to read or to post something oppositional, or that it's political at all. In fact, in most cases, again, simply statistically, it's not. They're going to Instagram to do the same thing that most people do on Instagram, which is post the photos of their life, look at the photos of their friends, I don't know, cappuccinos or what have you. So that's also another presumption that I feel is also often implicitly seen in reporting or in commentary about the media developments in Russia. So we also, again, for every 10 people that use VPN, most of them use it not for political or oppositional purposes. And so the last development that I want to highlight is the rise, rise of Telegram as an app, as a communication app of choice. Because again, the Facebook has been blocked, Twitter has been blocked, Instagram, not WhatsApp, again, interestingly, alongside YouTube has not been blocked, and Telegram. So for those who don't know, Telegram is originally Russian, but now it's based outside of Russia because it at one point Russian state tried blocking it, so it left Russia. Now the Russian state very much embraced Telegram. It's a mixture of a social network and a communication. Think of kind of a Twitter meets or Facebook/Twitter meets WhatsApp. So you can both use it for personal communication, but also you can start your own basically news channel, if you will, and you can subscribe to those news channels. And so the usership of Telegram jumped almost twofold, as you can see, from 21% to 37% now. And Telegram is, again, on the one hand, it is one of the last remaining platforms where this kind of free communication can happen. On the other hand, we shouldn't be too celebratory because just like with the internet in general, most Russians, just again, by numbers, when they're online, they go to Russian state media, right? Again, we shouldn't assume that if they're online, they go to oppositional media necessarily, even before the blocking, just generally speaking. And so the same is true for Telegram. So if you actually go to Telegram, so this is the 10 most, so I pulled the 10 most viewed news outlets on Telegram. So this is the Telegram channels of, let's say, BBC Russian service. So, right, the BBC Russian service itself is blocked in Russia, their website, so you have to use VPN, but you can access freely their content through their Telegram channel. And so these are the top 10 Telegram channels by the average number of views of their individual post here, which you can see in the rightmost column. And the second column from the right, you see their audience, the number of followers. And so with the clown face, of course, this the emojis were selected completely at random, don't read anything into it, any political significance, but the clown emojis signify the kind of the state-aligned media, and the emojis with shades signify kind of the oppositional media, if you will. And so you can see that on this Telegram, most of the most popular channels are clowns. Again, I don't mean it in any political way. These were selected completely at random. And so, in essence, there is no need or reason for the state to kind of, blog this. Because, Twitter and Facebook were these, if you will, there's a lot of, state aligned activity there as well, but they were sort of leaning oppositionally, let's say, right? But here we can see that that's not necessarily the case. And so I think I'm pretty much out of time, and I will leave it at that. And again, obviously, I wasn't able to cover everything that's happened in the past 3 months, which have been some of the most eventful, unfortunately, in many ways, including what's been happening with the Russian media landscape. And so I just tried to give you kind of bullet points on, on the latest to bring us up to date on what's been happening over the past 3 months. And so I'm happy to take the questions in the Q&A. And thanks again for coming and for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Stanislav. Thanks a lot for the interesting presentation and the insights in your research. It was really, interesting and enjoyable at the same time. I'm not an expert on the Russian media system, but I also work on media freedom, on media system change, and I found it really interesting how you explained the shift, how you really describe the media system change, very careful on the state level, on the institutional level, but then also the fight for narratives, I would say. Everybody out there, the audience is invited to post questions in the questions answer tool. I'm reading also a thank you from Cornelia Ulbert from the Institute for Development and Peace. She is writing, as enlightening as it was, as sobering it was at the same time, in essence, the narrative of the Russian state was and still is successfully disseminated through the Russian media landscape. The question for you is, do you see any chances to change this at least a bit?
So we just saw some of the ways in which this journalists now in exile are, trying to change it. I don't think it's possible to change the dominance of the Russian narrative. As you saw, the numbers are just incompatible. The numbers of people who are receiving the alternative or seeking in the first place, because it's hard to. It was hard before, but nowadays it's nearly impossible to accidentally stumble, if you will, upon these, alternative narratives, or it's getting harder and harder. So the numbers are completely incompatible, and so unfortunately, I want to be optimistic. And in the long term, perhaps I am in the long historical perspective, but not in any immediate term. Certainly not in any way that can influence the events on the ground of the war. In the sense that the authorities will look at the public and say, oh, we need to stop the war because the alternative narrative or the oppositional narrative is so strong that it's swaying public opinion. So unfortunately, no, I see this is not. It's not even close, so to speak, right? Not even remotely. Again, as we saw from the numbers of people who are getting their news from TV, trusting TV, we see. In front of you right now on the screen, we see the Telegram, where most of the, let's say, top 10 news channels are kind of state aligned. So even when people have the ability to do so, and these are the people who are using Telegram. So this is already a self-selected group of people who are more technologically and media, if you will, literate than an average person. So put simply, unfortunately, the answer is no. I don't see changing at all. And again, as hopeful as the appearance of this the 6 channels is, we have to bear in mind that, again, and I did the math. I added up their viewership, and it adds up very generously. I rounded up to the to the larger number, and so it adds up to 800,000, for example, right? Whereas their channel has 3.2 million. Again, it's a great achievement to reach them in that, and in just a few weeks or a few months of existence for this channels, and maybe one day it will reach what it was. But any startups, any new things that are appearing right now, we should juxtapose it against what it was, because, for example, the main radio station was also shut down, and again, on its ruins, we see various YouTube channels emerging of its former journalists and of the radio station itself. But again, we should compare it to what it was literally on February 23rd, before the war. And so whatever hopeful signs we're seeing, they're merely trying to rebuild from scratch, sort of what's been ruined overnight. Thank you for your question.
Thanks, Stanislav. I was wondering in the same direction, and I'm just putting one question too. What do you think? How does this maybe shape the global conversation, like what we are seeing now, and how the state narrative is changing, and with the increased mention, for example, the example of the genocide mentions, how does this change the global conversation around war or global security? Could you elaborate on this? What identities do you think are constructed here?
Sorry, do you mind elaborating a little further? So how does the Russian state, because what I was addressing is mostly domestic, or kind of the picture that I was trying to paint is mostly domestic. So what?
You described very well the fight, like from the international media system and the Russian media outlets. And is there a spillover? Do we see effects of how war is discussed globally? Do you think there will be an effect?
So it's hard to tell. It's an interesting question. In terms of the spillover effect, the one in terms of internet governance, there has been certainly a spillover effect in that what we're also seeing is an unprecedented behavior by Western platforms, in that they have, for the first time, been so overtly, political or geopolitical. I mean, of course, platforms have politics, and would be incorrect to suggest that they never had politics. Like, of course, they're very highly political and geopolitical, but for the first time, basically, they blocked Russian, let's say YouTube and Twitter, blocked Russian state media channels in Russian language, and some of RT, the Russia Today. And so this has been also unprecedented. Or Facebook and Instagram at the beginning of the war made an exception to allow its users to call for violence, I believe, against Russians, and specifically for the death of Putin, by way of exception, which is generally prohibited in their platform. So we are definitely seeing a spillover effect in terms of the internet governance and internet regulation. And so the question that internet scholars are asking is whether this is setting a, as sympathetic as everyone is, toward Ukraine and what's happening, obviously, but the scholars are asking whether that's opening kind of a Pandora's box, because when private actors who are now in charge or reign over so much of the public discourse, when they begin, and in this conflict, for example, it may be kind of very black and white, so to speak, right? But maybe in another conflict, it won't be. And then will the public be happy with the Facebook allowing certain policies or YouTube blocking certain channels or not? And that's something for us to think about. Kind of, so in terms of spillover effect, this has been a major one in my observation. And another one is that what it also surfaced is because what they also shut down is Russian language channels outside of Russia addressing, so not RT in English, let's say, addressing American audiences, but Russian language channel addressing basically Russian diasporic populations in Germany or Australia or Canada or the UK or the United States, because what we saw is this phenomenal event of this rallies in support of Russia's war, in Sydney, in Berlin, and across the world, which has been quite a shocking thing to observe, because again, the first thing that the people say, well, those people have access to all the media. They live in societies with access to whatever media they desire to view, and yet they consume Russian language media and hold rallies in support of Russia's aggression. So those channels have been also blocked, and that's been a very interesting development and something to study further.
Thanks for the comparative perspective. I'd like to pick up two more questions from the chat. A guest is saying, thank you, Stanislav. Is there an analysis of the age groups that use the different Telegram news channels that you listed?
I have not come across it. That's would be very interesting to see. I would imagine, and I saw the question, so I scrolled back to this to the slide with a breakdown of internet use generally by age. And so I don't know if that helps us kind of theorize or hypothesize about the age of different age differences between the different Telegram channels. My kind of gut feeling is that there may be an age difference, but it wouldn't be massive, because again, the Telegram users are already such a self-selected group that if the first barrier you clear is getting your news on the internet in general, the second, which is a lot of the population, but as we can see from the chart, still a part of it. And then the second barrier you clear is being on Telegram. And then the third barrier you clear is being politically minded or interested in politics enough to subscribe to specific news channels. So this is a very self-selected group. And I imagine that it will be fairly coherent-ish, or like there will be like a range from 18 to, as we can see here, maybe 40 or so. But within that, I'm also curious as to see the range, but it wouldn't be huge. It wouldn't be, say 18-year-olds are reading BBC Russian, and then the 60-year-olds are there reading state-aligned Telegram channel. So it would be, I think, if not the same, then the range would not be too large, because of that 3-level self-selection, if you will.
There is a follow-up question on this, if you don't mind. Does any analysis exist of the numbers of users of the government-friendly Telegram news channels that moved to opposition news channels?
Sorry, of the government, I'm going to read the question, of users.
The government-friendly Telegram news channels.
That moved, that turned oppositional, that were initially kind of pro-governmental, and then they turned oppositional. Is that, Carl, if you don't mind clarifying whether that's the question?
He is clarifying, yes.
Oh, I mean, I have not heard of such developments because some Telegram channels are, I mean, let me put it this way. There are some figures in Russian mediascape who, over the years, have worked in oppositional media or have portrayed or identified themselves or taken part in oppositional activities and have over the years, become more, let's say, pro-governmental, and are now working for RT. There are several notorious people or notorious presenters like that. There is, I can name off the top of my head, five or so, at least five, if not more, if not a dozen of those people who currently are at RT, for example, or other pro-governmental media. There are, I'm sure, also some, or we know that there is, some people disillusioned in the government and have actually come out against the government propaganda or resigned publicly during the war. So that has also been another development that I didn't mention, because it has received a lot of attention, but it doesn't, it becomes kind of this media event in and of itself, but it doesn't, it's not really representative in a sense that there is no mass exodus from these channels. So this doesn't pertain specifically to Telegram channels, but there have been some very public resignations. And maybe you heard in the beginning of the war, there was even kind of a protest, a disruption of a live protest by this one journalist on Russia's main channel, Channel 1, who has since then has been hired by I'm not sure, Welt, the German media company, their Russian service as well. So can't speak to the Telegram, but generally there has been some, again, public resignations or public formerly pro-governmental journalists or journalists working for governmental channels have decried Russia's actions. But again, this has been, maybe a dozen of famous names, but they don't constitute a mass movement or something that we can that matters statistically, if you will. Symbolically it does, and maybe it did send a signal, and hopefully and likely it sent signal to some people or some of their colleagues, but it's still a matter of kind of curiosity rather than any notable statistically notable or kind of politically potent development.
He is also pointing out that he was rather pointing to the number of consumers rather than providers.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah, I've not seen, again, would be very interested in seeing that. Again, my gut feeling is my answer would be no, because I'm sure some of, let's say, Putin supporters have been shocked by what's going on and were terrified and said, oh my God, we supported Putin, but we could never imagine that it would come to this. I'm sure there is a number of those people, but, most people tend to dig into their pre-existing, biases and justify the ongoing events in terms of those. And so we saw a lot of reporting, very tragic, I guess I would call this reporting, of family members from Ukraine calling from literal, bombshell shelters or, coming under fire and calling live to their family members in Russia or sending them, WhatsApp messages with photos and videos, and their Russian relatives just not believing them and saying, oh, you are clearly watching Ukrainian propaganda. This is Ukrainians bombing you. This is Ukrainians bombing you and trying to pass it off as Russians, or this is all fake. This is not actually happening. So I think it's much more likely that on average, an average person, average media consumer would kind of dig their heels into their pre-existing political framework or media consumption patterns, rather than go, the other way when they were, horrified by the outbreak of this war. Again, I'm sure there are those people exist, but it's a matter of, again, in a country of 145 million people, how many people of those and what, if any, and my guess or my sentiment is that it's likely a non-influence that will have, at least in the short to medium term, on Russia's actions and Russia's kind of strategy in Ukraine.
There's a question on the Western sanctions also. Are any effects of the Western sanctions reflected in the Russian media or social media? From our Western point of view, we hope that the negative effects of the sanctions will be associated with a delegitimization of the Russian government or the Russian state. Can you detect any of this?
Mm-hmm. So I have two parts to the question. First of all, obviously part of the idea behind sanctions, or part of the hope in the West by Western publics, by Western elites, is that the sanctions will, so to speak, turn Russians against Putin. I will break it down further by saying that it's much more likely that, or I shouldn't say much more likely, I'd say there's two audiences here. There's the elites, and then there's the wider publics. So I don't believe in the kind of public uprising, against this regime. I think if and when any sort of change of that sort might come, it will be from and this seems to be the consensus of, political scientists observing the situation, or just generally speaking, informed observers, that it's not going to be, the masses, so to speak, right? So there are two audiences to the sanctions as well, and two audiences that are targeted by sanctions, and that the West hopes to influence: the elites and the masses. So, and I think that if anything, it will be much more likely the elites that will do something. Let's say, although again, I'm not buying into the rumors, that have surfaced since day one of how everyone's about to turn against Putin and overthrow him or kill him or whatnot. Again, I think this is wishful thinking on the part of many Western observers. And so, as for the second assumption is that the people's logic will be, well, Putin's regime caused the sanctions, therefore we are against Putin's regime. But again, once again, coming back to what I just said with the previous questions, it's much more likely, and we know this even from just, our experience of living in the world, that people will turn against the West, who imposed the sanctions, rather than against Putin's regime and say, well, Putin initiated. No, it will be partly, also because they are bombarded, all day long with the narratives of that, this is, look at the West, they're stupid, they're evil, they are cutting off their own food, they're the ones who are harmed by the sanctions. And so the idea that the sanctions will turn the Russians against their own government rather than the West that imposed it, I think also is very much wishful thinking. So I think the point of sanction was to put pressure kind of on the regime and the power elite, and send a more of a, I guess, moral signal that this is not okay, rather than there should be kind of any hope again of the mass sort of uprising against the regime because of the sanctions. And the second part, so that concerns kind of the logic of people's thinking about the sanctions. But the second part, or rather their political conclusions that they will draw from the sanctions. But the second part is about the sanctions themselves, and they are definitely felt. And I have talked about, because my area of research expertise has to do more with national level media, but I think what people who will be very interesting to listen to and who should be invited to give these talks and on panels are people start studying, both Russian kind of in-depth Russian networks and Russian regional, specifically online forums, regional newspapers, regional and local message groups, and groups that have nothing to do with politics per se. Because those reports are definitely coming, that there's a lot of, in those groups that, we like to, or a lot of, academics, myself included, like to focus on, main TV channels, where state narratives are translated. But again, this underbelly, if you will, the media underbelly, which actually is where people actually air their grievances and in some ways talk to each other more frankly than anywhere else, is what is very interesting to observe. And there we definitely see reports of people being very unhappy with the lack of car parts, with the growing prices, with all of those things. And no kind of facade and no state narrative can tell you that it's okay if it becomes so much cheaper to buy food or to fix your car. But again, we're coming back to part one of my questions: what people will do that with that information, and whether they will link it to, let's say, the regime's actions and conclude that they should oppose the regime, that step I'm not so certain about, or quite skeptical about, if I'm being frank. But those conversations and those grievances in those, parents' chats, or on WhatsApp, or local forum, online forum for car lovers or car users, or whatever. Those are the spaces, or local newspapers even, because some of the first reporting before the national channels reported any losses, the first reporting on the losses came from local and regional press, which were covering, because it's hard to, if you live in a small town and you have a body coming back from Ukraine, it's harder to hide. And they had kind of pompous funerals honoring the soldiers, and which were covered in the local press as heroes before the national media or the national level politicians even admitted publicly that there were any losses. Because if you recall, in the first weeks of the war, there was no recognition of any losses at all, which was bizarre and absurd, while the whole world knew that there were thousands of lives lost. And so those spaces are incredibly, and so I'm urging those people organizing such events to really turn to and listen to scholars of Russian regional media and kind of local media and small niche media.
Thanks a lot. I think those spaces and the online communities, and the question at what point or under what circumstances they turn politically is incredibly interesting. We have one last question, maybe. Do you expect WhatsApp to continue to be allowed in Russia?
For the time being, yes, I would say. So I'm going to go back to the slide where I had. So this is, YouTube, we see that it's being used by 46% of respondents, and also WhatsApp is the single most popular messaging app. As we can see, 66% are using it. So because WhatsApp and YouTube are so incredibly popular, and because WhatsApp is used primarily, again, just as simply a communication tool. So Telegram is much more political, but WhatsApp really is, for the most part, just people, again, parents groups and personal communication. It is not a political force as it is, for example, in Brazil and in some other contexts where I know WhatsApp plays a major political role and electoral role. So I don't, because this would be, I'd say, too much. If Russia does block, if and when Russia does block WhatsApp, that things are really bad, because it is too much of a political liability. Because with all the political and media control, the state does not like to, this regime does not like to anger or, upset its populations. And again, because most people are using it for rather apolitical purposes, there really is no reason. Again, we saw that even in politicized Telegram, a lot of people are reading pro, state-aligned narratives. So there simply is no political benefit or reason to block WhatsApp. Now, we kind of thought the same thing about Instagram, which also a lot of people use, and we thought that too many people use it, and there is no Russian and equivalent to that. So I, for example, thought that it wouldn't be blocked because I thought it was too risky, but they did take the step. However, I think for YouTube, even though there's been all this talk constantly of blocking it, I think still the risk is too high, because again, there is no Russian equivalent, and there is a lot of pro-governmental content as well on YouTube. Again, don't be fooled into thinking that it's all opposition. There's also a lot of pro-governmental content with millions of views. So very unlikely with WhatsApp, slightly more likely YouTube. But again, for the time being, I think they think they have done enough to really secure kind of the narrative. And I think they really did. So I don't think there's all these other ways and tools of kind of tightening the space of that free expression. So I don't think that it would make sense or be logical for them to antagonize the population with such moves.
Stanislav, thank you for all the insights on your research, even though it's such a under such upsetting circumstances, terrible circumstances. It was so interesting to have this conversation with you. It was a pleasure to have you. I think we are running out of time here, and it's yeah, time to call it a meeting, a interesting lecture. Thank you so much. And here's something for the next time. On June the 14th, we will have the next talk about the economic effects of the war. And I think the link is here in the chat. But Stanislav, yeah, thanks for giving this presentation. Thanks for the interesting conversation and discussion afterwards. And have a good evening. Have a good.
Thank you. Thanks so much for the invitation, and thanks to the audience member for attending and for asking this brilliant questions. Thank you.